I'm joined today by Lori Wallach, who is Director of Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch, and it's really a pleasure to have her here. Lori, we've been talking about TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for a while now, and there have been two areas of interest for me and for a lot of our audience. One is, what does TPP do, or what would it do? And then simultaneously, the secrecy with which it has been negotiated and the speed with which some legislators have wanted to kind of get it through and enact TPP. So let's take it piece by piece. What is TPP? What are the goals? What areas of life does it address?
The TPP has been branded as a trade agreement, but that's really a Trojan horse maneuver. It's got 29 chapters, and only 5 of them have anything to do with trade. Really, it's like a delivery mechanism for a set of retrograde corporate policy items, many of which have explicitly been rejected by the US Congress and by legislatures in the other countries that are involved in TPP. The way the TPP would work is the binding provision is each country shall ensure the conformity of all domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with the attached chapters. And then each of these chapters would set rules on things as diverse as the safety of the food we feed our children. We'd be required to import food that doesn't meet our safety standards, whether or not we're allowed to regulate the banksters. It could roll back some of the reforms after the global financial crisis. For instance, right now, the U.S. is insisting that every signatory simply be forbidden from using capital controls, which are, and financial speculation taxes, instruments that have proved to be very useful in avoiding the terms that set a crisis. Or there are rules that would limit internet freedom, that basically sneak through the back door some of the elements of SOPA and PIPA, the legislation that Congress rejected a year and a half ago. Or there are rules relating both to patents and to what are called medicine formularies. Those are the lists of medicines that programs like the VA or Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE get lists of medicines that they'll reimburse at certain rates that they'll pay the pharmaceutical companies. And those are cost savings for medicines. There are rules in there Big Pharma wanted both to extend patents and to allow them to challenge those pricing decisions that could jack up medicine prices. And then if that all weren't enough, these outrageous new corporate rights and privileges, in addition to the constraints on regulation. And the worst one of those is the investor state system, which would elevate any individual foreign company operating in any of the 11 other TPP countries to have the same status as the US government, to challenge domestic laws outside our courts, to privately enforce a public treaty against the US by suing the US government in extrajudicial tribunals, or 3 trade attorneys without conflict of interest rules who rotate between suing governments and being the judge get to decide how much taxpayer money a corporation should be reimbursed for the cost of having to follow basic health, safety, environmental, land use regulations.
So what was the impetus, or who got together and when and said, let's work together on this thing called TPP, right? What circumstances kind of even created this idea?
So there are 600 official U.S. corporate trade advisors. This is at the crux of our problem. These guys are setting the so-called U.S. trade policy as a corporate trade policy, and mixed in there are in with the 600 are about 30 unions, environmental consumer groups, so totally overwhelmed. And these advisors got very frustrated because they basically wanted to expand NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's been so devastating for U.S. jobs and devastating for Mexican agriculture, that's been a disaster of corporate attacks and environmental laws. They wanted to expand that to more countries, and they wanted to expand the rules to make them even more extreme. And they tried to do that, for instance, through the hemisphere as a thing called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And a lot of countries said, no, thank you, Brazil, Argentina, Jamaica. So this was their next attempt at trying to expand and deepen and lock in permanently their model. So these big bunch of corporate advisors pushed it. Heartbreakingly, the Obama administration, it was something Bush started in 2008. The Obama administration picked it up. They allegedly had a review, which was not real. and they just picked up the exact Bush agenda. And the State Department has a hand in it because they're trying to sell it as an anti-China mechanism, which of course is ludicrous because, as the trade negotiators in the U.S. regularly remind us, nothing would make them happier than if China joined. TPP is supposed to be a docking agreement, which means any additional country can join later.
It's fascinating to me because as we talk about all of the ways in which the Obama administration is very different than the Bush administration, we can't ignore all of the ways in which both are just heavily ingrained in this plutocratic, money-driven system that may not even really be the result, or actually I would go further, has nothing to do specifically with George W. Bush or with President Obama, but it shows us the limited power in some areas that one person can have. And when I look at the individual chapters of this TPP, the proposed agreement, the trend I see through all of them is either via more regulation or some cases less regulation. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a decision, it's a direction that favors big business and transnational business. Are there any outliers that aren't falling under that umbrella, or is every single chapter, either by adding regulation or taking it away, supporting the interests of big business?
Well, it certainly is the big business agenda, chapter by chapter, but I wouldn't say they're adding regulation on corporations.
No, certainly not. Well, what I was thinking, to be clear, what I was thinking of, to be clear, is with intellectual property, the chapter about intellectual property adds, maybe regulation's not the right word, but it adds legal infrastructure that certainly helps the big copyright holders.
Governments.
Right.
The TPP regulates governments and limits their ability to be able to implement the basic laws we need for our human needs and goals, and it gives new rights and powers to big companies. Now, interestingly, a lot of the small business groups and conservative groups are against TPP because they're against anything that only favors the big. And so the U.S. Business and Industry Council, a very conservative small business association, is against TPP because they realize their member companies are not going to benefit from this, just the big guys are.
What is there to be done in terms of slowing down the process, which so many people seem to have an interest in expediting as much as possible? What can the average person do? What's Public Citizen doing?
So here's the good news. The TPP is a little bit like Dracula. We need to drag it out of the darkness into the sunshine. The negotiating process has been incredibly closed, secretive. Congress hasn't been allowed to see the draft text until last year, even though it's been going on for almost 5 years. So first thing is get on to a great website. It's a joint website of a lot of groups. That's called exposethetpp.org. That's www.exposethetpp.org. It's got great basic materials on every way the TPP will affect our lives, which is everything. And the materials start from something you already care about: food safety, GMOs, the environment, climate, jobs, wages, inequality, and goes the other way towards how TPP affects the thing you care about. So exposethetpp.org, get involved, get aware, help other people wake up to it. To some degree in the past, some of these most outrageous agreements literally have been Dracula strategy to death. When they're drug out into the sunshine like Dracula, they do not survive. But we cannot assume that that's going to be enough. And the mainstream media has blacked out the TPP coverage. So we have to do it word of mouth. Part two is use the power we have in Congress. So the Congress has exclusive constitutional authority over trade. It's one of the strongest checks and balances in the Constitution, and it was a fallout of the Boston Tea Party. They didn't want any king, the president, not King George, to unilaterally impose a tariff. Those tea taxes were tariffs. So the founders gave all the authority over trade to Congress. In the last 20 years, Congress has largely held on to that authority, but for 5 years. For 5 years during the Bush administration, they gave what's called fast-track authority. This is an anomalous procedure that Richard Nixon cooked up. It's rarely been used in the history of the country. It never had even been thought of until 1973. And this fast-track procedure basically takes away Congress's normal ability to amend, review, debate a trade agreement. It basically, from the day a negotiation starts, gives the executive branch, it gives away Congress's powers, and Congress is forced to vote yes or no in 90 days, no amendments, limited debate, including the Senate. So no matter how terrible a trade agreement is, it almost always goes through if it's on fast track. That's how we got stuck with NAFTA, the World Trade Organization. So the great news is, right now, in the House of Representatives, which is where this fast track fight is happening, President Obama, the bad news is President Obama asked for fast track. He said he wouldn't when he was a candidate, and now he's in there asking for this legislative luge run procedure. Congress so far in the House has said no. Democrats and Republicans alike. To some degree, there are things that both the right and the left don't like who likes extrajudicial tribunals attacking U.S. laws and raiding the U.S. Treasury? Who likes a ban on Buy American? Neither Democrats nor Republicans. So right now, the most single important thing, besides getting the word out in TPP, is contact your House member, the member of the House of Representatives, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, and ask for a commitment in writing in a letter that he or she will oppose fast-track trade authority in all of its forms and retain their constitutional authority over trade. You can get a copy of that kind of a letter if you want to write it, or some talking points at our website, tradewatch.org. That's www.tradewatch.org. And what we're doing is making sure that the TPP would have to be publicly debated, exposed to the sunshine, because given what's in it, if it's normal review, it's not going to pass.
All right, we've been speaking with Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
This is viewer-supported independent media. Please support our program by going to davidpakman.com/membership and becoming a member today.